Hello everyone, my name's Carell, and today we're going to be taking a look at concepts of movement in From the Depths. This tutorial is going to be focused on all about how things move, not necessarily the specifics of any one vehicle, but the general concepts behind how things move, how the physics work. So in order to help demonstrate that, I've got this lovely brick platform flying thing here that is basically just a cluster of thrusters on each corner of the vehicle in every direction there. And I've got a battery with an electric engine and an RTG here providing my power. That is all stuff that you can find in the electrics tutorial if you're interested in how that works. I've also got an AI unit here, and this has 6 PIDs on it to help smooth out the movement in each direction of control. That will be the subject of a later video on tuning those PIDs and setting them up correctly. But for now, just assume that they're there and they are helping make movement smooth. So what we're going to look at first is that the movement in From the Depths is centered around the number 3. There's a lot of 3s here. There's 3 main concepts. There's 3 sub-ideas within each concept. So the first thing we're going to look at is centers. The concept of centers is basically everything that is relating to the center of something in a vehicle. We've got the center of mass, we've got the center of lift, and we've got the center of drag. The center of mass is often in the center of your vehicle, but that's not necessarily always the case. The center of mass is directly in the middle of where all of your weight is. That's not necessarily where the middle of your vehicle is. If I was to, say, go out here and grab some lead blocks so I can start adding some center of mass elsewhere, and let's just say I put a few of these out here. And we're tipping a little bit until that evens out. So that's moving our center of mass backwards, but it's also moving it upwards. If I was to put a bunch more lead out over the top here, and then plop some down this direction, you can see my center of mass has moved up significantly. If I was to add, let's say, some more back here, the center of mass is now outside of any normal block. That's because the center of mass is not tied to blocks, it's tied to where your weight is located on the vehicle. So that's where it goes. What does the center of mass do for us? Well, the center of mass is going to dictate where you want your thrust on your vehicle. We're going to get into that a little bit later when we start talking about what axes of movement we have to control. So what are these axes of movement? Well, there are 6 different axes of movement in From the Depths. There are 3 translational axes and there are 3 rotational axes. The translational are the obvious ones. They're the forwards and backwards, the left and right, or strafing as From the Depths calls it, and the up and down, or lift. Those are your translational axes, and if I take a look back here, you can see I've got these thrusters on the back of the vehicle. Those are going to push us forward. So those are forward translational thrusters. Likewise, I've got these 4 thrusters on the bottom down here. Those are firing straight upwards and keeping this vehicle in the air. Those are upwards translational thrusters. The ones on the top are downwards translational thrusters. The ones on the front are backwards translational thrusters. And the ones on each side are strafing translational thrusters. So every thruster on this vehicle is a translational thruster in some form or fashion. We've also got the 3 rotational axes, and these are yaw, pitch, and roll. Yaw is turning left or right with no nose up or down or anything like that. It's just taking the nose and turning it to the left, or taking the nose and turning it to the right. Pitch is taking the nose and pointing it upwards or downwards. And roll is, say, if you're tipping up on your side. So if I had a wingtip on here, that would be pointing one wingtip towards the ocean and one wingtip towards the sky. So those are our 6 axes. In order to control ourselves in each of those directions, we have what I like to call control authority. And this is a concept that's not really tied to From the Depths necessarily, but it's something I've seen sort of around. The concept of control authority is basically how much control do I have along any given axis of movement. So how much control do I have going upwards? Well, I've got 4 jets, and they each have the ability to fire at 100% thrust, facing in the up direction here. So if I look at my translational movement axes UI here, this is set to up 1, which means I have up to 100% of my force being applied in the upwards direction from this thruster. And all 4 of these thrusters on the bottom are set up this way. So that handles our translational upwards movement. And again, in the rear here, we have 2 forwards-facing thrusters. Those are going to handle our translational movement forward. On the left and right, we have strafe, all that sort of thing. Those thrusters are each giving us control authority in each of those translational directions. So control authority is gained by placing thrusters in line with the center of mass, if you're talking about a translational axis, or centered around the center of mass, again talking about translational. Or if you're talking about rotational axes, you gain control authority by placing thrusters away from the center of mass. So for instance, if I have a thruster, let's see, the center of mass is right in the center of this flat plate here. If I place a thruster right here, this is not going to give me any rotational axis control authority. It is right in line with the center of mass. It's going to be pushing straight forward. So that is giving me forward-reverse translational axis control, but it is not giving me any yaw, pitch, or roll control on the rotational side. Likewise, over here, if I was to try and place a thruster directly in line with the center of mass on this side, this would be a strafe translational thruster. This would give me side-to-side movement control, but again, it's not going to give me any yaw, pitch, or roll. Now that's not exactly true, what I just said, because it's going to be very slightly offset from the center of mass in almost every case you run into. In this case, I've got everything perfectly balanced vertically around this flat metal plate, except I've got a bunch of extra weight on the top from batteries and an RTG. So my center of mass is actually very slightly above the center line of this flat plate. So what's that going to do? Well, this jet engine is very slightly below that center of mass, so anytime I push forward from this, I'm going to be pushing the opposite side up. I'm going to be pushing this side down and the opposite side up, which is going to roll the vehicle. Well, as it so happens, I have some roll control authority in here, so the roll control authority is going to be used by the AI to counteract that kind of torquing movement. That's an important thing to note, and we are going to come back to that later. So what are the important things to do when dealing with control authority? Well, corners of the vehicles and edges of the vehicles are very important for gaining control authority. The further away from the center of mass, the further away from in line with the center of mass a thruster is, the more control authority it's going to generate for a given axis. However, the closer towards the center of mass, or the more balanced around the center of mass a given set of thrusters is, the more control authority it's going to exert in a translational axis. So what we're going to do here is note that these 2 jet engines are exactly balanced around the center of mass here, so we can use those at full thrust without torquing the vehicle in any direction. We're not going to be applying any rotational axis control when those are firing at full throttle. So a good analogy here is to imagine having a flat sheet of like cardboard or a big piece of Lego or a stiff card or whatever you want to imagine, and imagine placing that on top of your finger and balancing it there. Just extend your finger upwards, place that flat plate on top of it, and just think about trying to balance that there. If you push down on any one corner of that, it's going to tilt that corner downwards, and it's going to tilt the opposite corner upwards, because the center of mass of that plate is right in the center, and additionally you've added your finger as a pivot point there, but that's irrelevant from the depths and analogies here. If you think about that flat plate as being your vehicle here, If I push down in, say, the front left corner of my flat plate or my vehicle, that corner is going to go down. I'm applying roll, I'm applying pitch, and both of those are coming from this single thruster. So you can kind of think of the center of mass as being that pivot point, that central axis around which each of your thrusters are going to operate. Now, I haven't really mentioned center of lift or center of drag. Center of lift is more or less the center of where all of the lift on your vehicle is coming from. In this case, I've got 4 thrusters applying lift spaced evenly around the vehicle, or around the center of mass, rather. So those are going to be applying a fairly even, consistent amount of lift. You've also got the center of drag, and you'll note that this red indicator for center of drag here is kind of skipping around. That's because the vehicle is not really going forwards or backwards right now, it's just kind of jittering back and forth a little bit. So more or less what the center of drag is it is the center of a reverse force, that is the center of resistance being applied to your vehicle when you're traveling in a specific direction. If I was to give this vehicle forward thrust, it would come out to one side very clearly, and the center of drag would be around that flat plate, or rather around that direction. And if I was to put, let's say, a flat plate of blocks up here in the forwards direction, my center of drag has now moved upwards. If I take a look at where the center of drag is, it's gone up a fair bit. Why is that? Well, it's because I've added a lot of drag above the center of mass here, and so my center of drag has gone above my center of mass because that's where the drag of the vehicle is located. If I try and push forward against this, I'm going to get a reverse force on that center of drag. Now, for the most part, for a well-mirrored vehicle, the center of drag isn't going to play a big role in how you construct your vehicles. But it can be important for some things, so it's important to know what it is at least. Alright, so the center of mass is the center of our weight. That has other important effects that we need to pay attention to. One thing that's important to notice is that the more weight we add to the vehicle, the slower our acceleration is going to be. And that applies to both translational and rotational axes. However, it does not apply equally to translational and rotational axes. So if I've got a translational axis, say forwards here, and I go in and add, say, a ton of weight on one end of this vehicle. So let's just grab some lead beams, and we're just going to plop a bunch of those on down over here. So I've got a nice big heavy weight on this end of the vehicle. That's not going to matter for my thrust at all. My thrust is still going to continue straight forward along the center of mass. In fact, I moved the center of mass up a little bit, so if anything, I'm going to be pushing the nose upwards or pitching up a little bit when I start applying forwards thrust. But that's not necessarily the end of the world. My pitch thrusters should be able to compensate for that. However, they are going to have to be fighting the forwards thrusters, so they're not going to have quite as much remaining control authority, there's that term again, when they attempt to actually pitch the nose down if I was to give this thing a nose down control signal. So the weight there is not very important as far as its location for the center, or for translational axes movement, except insofar as it moves the center of mass around, which can put our thrusters out of alignment. Where it is important is our rotational axes. If I put a bunch of weight back here, think about trying to turn this vehicle now. I've got a huge weight in the back. Now if I try and turn the vehicle, that weight is going to have to accelerate a lot more than if this weight was in, say, the center of the vehicle. If I was to bring this weight up here and plop it down right in line with the center of mass by just saying, adding a pole up here of lead blocks for some bizarre reason, my center of mass has gone upwards, so my translational axis is now adding quite a bit of pitch up if I was to try and thrust forwards. But as far as my rotational axis, or say the yaw axis, I am not actually doing much to it here in terms of slowing it down. So what constitutes enough control authority? Well, that's an answer that can only be answered in terms of your specific vehicle. There's no such thing as enough control authority or too much control authority. You can't really ever have too much thrust or too little thrust in total without talking about how heavy your vehicle is, how large it is, how much drag is there, how fast you want it to accelerate. All of that sort of thing can only be answered on a vehicle-by-vehicle basis. So there is some trial and error when you're talking about experimenting with this. The only answer that I can give you as to what constitutes enough control authority is the amount that lets you control your vehicle as quickly as you want it to. Really, that's all it boils down to. If I add a ton of extra mass to this vehicle by spamming lead blocks all over it, then I need to be able to counter that weight with my acceleration. Otherwise, I'm just not doing the job. I don't have enough control authority. So if I was to say just go completely crazy here, if I add just a ton of lead blocks, and it looks like this still isn't enough. As I was saying, if I add a ton of lead blocks, there we go. You'll note that my thrusters are no longer capable of keeping me in the air. That is not enough control authority in the upwards translational axis. So what I can do there is add more jet engines. Now, where do I want to place these? If I'm looking at the center of mass here, and my problem is that I don't have enough upwards translational thrust, then I can add these directly in line with the center of mass or centered around the center of mass, like so. And if I unlock this here, we are back off and flying. You'll note that we are pitching here because I did not add these lead blocks evenly. They are quite far towards the back there. And we're going to struggle a little bit to get the vehicle back under control. It will eventually happen, but it's much less smooth because we've added a ton of mass on the top of this vehicle. Another important thing to note, the further away from the center of mass your thrusters are, the more control authority they exert. So in the pitch direction, we have these thrusters up here in the front and back. These are exerting a lot more control authority per thruster than the ones in the roll direction. So if I look at these as a pitch thruster, they are, let's call that about 25 blocks away from the center of mass. These up here are about 25 or in fact 30 blocks away from the center of mass because our center of mass has moved backwards due to the lead block offset. So these are exerting even more control authority than the ones in the back in the direction of pitch. Well, if we look at the roll, these aren't spaced very far away from the center of mass. That's, about 3 beams worth, so that's probably about 12 blocks away from the center of mass. So these aren't exerting as much roll control authority as we would like. And in fact, it looks like I don't have enough power to power all of my jet engines here. So I've started slowly going down. The movement control UI, that's a very important topic when dealing with any sort of thruster. Now, this UI comes up when we're talking about jet engines. It comes up when we're talking about ion thrusters, custom jets, dedicated helicopter blades, tailplanes, ailerons, universal flight surfaces. This comes up everywhere. It's just all over the place. Even in the water tab, if I talk about propellers, it's going to come up there. If I talk about hydrofoils, it's going to come up there. If I talk about rudders, again, it's going to come up there, though not really as much, because the default configuration settings for rudders are usually sufficient. Anyway, so this is going to come up all over the place. So we're going to take a very in-depth look at this UI. The most important tab here is the propulsion response. We can get into the advanced controller options if we want to, but realistically, you can get from an advanced controller to the propulsion response area without much trouble. And I'm going to turn off the strafe and hover here for a moment just to see what this looks like by default. What we have here is the drive section, the presets and filters, translational movement, rotational movement, drive factors, and settings. And summary. That's a lot of information. Honestly, most of it you don't need to interact with when you start dealing with a thruster. So what we're going to do here is just start from the top and walk our way through. First things first, the drive. You don't really need to mess with this. If you're using a AI control or you're using a manual control, setting this drive factor is going to do nothing. It's going to get overridden by the actual controller that is driving this engine. So I really don't need to pay attention to that. Presets and filters is a little more interesting. Here I've got 8 buttons. I can reset what this thruster is doing. That's going to wipe out all of its settings. I can copy its settings. I can paste its settings from a clipboard. I can spread its settings to all touching thrusters. And this can get you in trouble here. It's worth noting because I have this huge jet engine here. It's touching several other jet engines, which are touching even another jet engine. If I try and spread to neighbors this set of control settings, it's going to percolate all over these things, and it's not going to do what I want it to do because all of these thrusters are going to get the same settings as the downwards corner thruster back here, and that's not going to do what I want it to. So below this I have 4 preset buttons. There's a turner, pitcher, roller, and pusher. The turner, pitcher, and roller preset buttons control how this thruster behaves around the rotational axes, and the pusher handles how it operates in the translational axes. Well, this is important. Why does it have all 3 rotational and only 1 translational axis? Well, this is because any given thruster can be used to operate 2 or even 3 rotational axes, but each thruster can only translate you in one direction, directly anyway. So if I look at this thruster pointing down, if I try and use this to control which direction I'm moving in, I'm really never going to get that to move me forward unless I already have pitch going on. I'm really never going to get that to move me side to side unless I'm constantly rolling. So right there, that eliminates 2 out of the 3 translational axes. So the pusher preset is going to be talking about moving me up or down. And the game knows this. It's only ever going to be pushing me up or down. So under this we've got 5 checkboxes here, and these are basically options for what's displayed on this UI. If I start turning more and more of these on, the UI starts getting more and more complex. And this is sometimes usable, sometimes useful rather, but for the most part I find having the strafe and hover settings on is enough to control almost as complex of a vehicle as I care to control. Now I could see using miscellaneous or custom axes if you're using those features with, say, a breadboard or an ACB circuit or something along those lines, but for the most part the strafe and hover is enough to get the point across. So if I'm looking at the strafe and hover checkbox, if I turn that off, it's only going to allow me to set up forwards-back translational movement. Why is that? Well, this UI is first and foremost geared towards, say, ships. And ships, if you think about where they're thrusting, they usually don't use turning thrusters. They usually don't use propellers on the front or back of the ship to turn it. They usually use a rudder to turn. They don't slide side to side. They don't use propellers in the bottom direction, pushing it up to keep it out of the water, or pushing downwards for some bizarre reason to keep it in the water. So if you're talking about the translational movement axis, the most common axis of movement is going to be your forwards back, because almost every vehicle is going to use that. That's important to note, but if we turn on the strafe and hover, it's going to give us, again, all 3 of our translational movement axes here that we can control. So I tend to turn this on because in the case of a vehicle like this, I've got upwards and downwards facing thrusters, I've got side-to-side facing thrusters, and I want to be able to control their UI in order to make them strafe or give lift or downwards force. So we've talked about the translational movement axes. What we need to look at right now is the rotational. The rotational movement is a little bit interesting because each thruster here can exert control authority easily in 2 different rotational directions at once. Or up to 2 rather, depending on its location in relation to the center of mass. So if I look at this back left thruster, facing downwards. Compared to the center of mass, it's in the back direction, so it will have pitch control authority because it is not in line with the center of mass, and it is left of the center of mass, so it will have roll control authority. If I was to add a pair of thrusters pointing downwards here in line with the center of mass, these are going to give me roll control authority, but they're going to do basically nothing in terms of pitch. If I try and talk about these in terms of pitch, essentially what I'm doing is thrusting downwards directly in line with the center of mass in order to try and pitch the vehicle forwards and backwards, and that's not going to work. If I go back to my card analogy, if I have a card centered on the top of my finger and I try and push down on the sides exactly left and right of my finger, it's not going to pitch the card forwards or backwards, it's just going to bend the card over my finger, or it's going to push downwards on my finger from the depths vehicle terms. So these thrusters are not going to be able to exert any control authority in the pitch direction, they are only there for roll. That can actually be useful though. If I take a look at these thrusters back here, what they're doing right now is they're acting as my downwards thrusters, they're acting as my pitch up thrusters, and they're acting as my roll left thrusters. And, well, for the specific one, rather. If I look at this one, it's going to be downwards thruster, it's going to be roll right thruster, because pushing down on the right side is going to roll towards the right, and it's going to be a pitch up thruster, because it's behind the center of mass. Pushing down here is going to raise the nose. So this again is the down translational, pitch up rotational, and roll right rotational. But let's say that I don't want to use these thrusters for all of that. In fact, let's give an example here. I'm going to do something very stupid, and something that you would hopefully never do with a vehicle. And I'm going to take lead blocks and just stick, well, a stick off of the front of this. And I'm going to keep moving this stick further and further out until I see the vehicle tipping beyond the point of no return in the pitch direction. And this is going to take a fair bit of weight to do. And again, because the mass is getting further and further from the center of mass, this weight that I'm adding, each block is actually affecting my center of mass, but it's also further from the center of mass, so it's affecting my rotational control authority more and more. Wow, this has really taken a lot of thrust. Or rather, a lot of mass to counter my available thrust. Alright, so it looks like we hit the tipping point there. This is going to tip downwards, and it's never going to be able to correct. So I'm going to lock the vehicle in place, and we have one very long lead stick on the nose of this thing. We are now renaming this vehicle to the Pinocchio. Moving on. We've got our backwards thrusters firing full downwards to try and, well, looks like they're trying to exert downwards control authority, downwards thrust. And okay, so we don't have enough control authority to keep this nose up. There's actually a trick we can pull here, where I want to, say, add some jet engines, and I want to add more pitch control authority, right? So if I was to add, say, some jet engines under here, and let's see, actually, where's our center of mass? That will be a better demonstration for this. So I'm going to add these around the center of mass. These are going to be pushers. They're going to be upwards facing thrusters. Now these three upwards facing thrusters are just going to give us some additional thrust. And in order to counter the power draw requirements of those, I'm going to pop this guy down. Alright. So what we've done there is basically make these 3 thrusters take some of the weight off the vehicle. And my PIDs are being a little slow to respond here to the changing pitch needs of the vehicle because we've added so much extra mass and it's so far offset. But what we can do here is take a look at our jet engines that are furthest back and forward, and we're actually going to remove the up control from these. So these are no longer going to be used for strafing up or rather translational up or down movement. And I need to do this fairly evenly across all these thrusters. And what that's done is it's shifted off the translational control authority. And in fact, this is no longer pitch up, that is wrong. And likewise for this one, because these are now behind the center of mass. That's important to note. The center of mass moved, so these thrusters are no longer doing what they used to do. And likewise for these, they're going to be incorrect because the center of mass moved past them. So I'm going to remove their pitch control authority. So these thrusters back here are now exerting control authority downwards. They are, in fact, now balancing that stick out there because we added more upwards thrust out near the center of mass and then took the upwards and downwards thrust away from those thrusters in the back. So the thrusters in the back are now controlling the pitch more accurately because they don't have to work so hard at keeping the vehicle in the air. If I was to go back here and re-add the up-down thrust on these jet engines down here, you can see what it's going to do. It's going to try and turn those on at full throttle because I had those at 100%, and it's going to essentially pitch the nose down because it's trying to exert lift from back here. So by turning those off, I've effectively increased the amount of control authority available elsewhere in the vehicle for pitch. Alright, so back to our control UI here. We've got the drive factors area. This is something that's kind of a relic of the past. It is there mostly for compatibility purposes. You can get some use out of it, but for the most part, really all it's doing is dealing with control from certain types of manual controllers, and it's not really that useful in an advanced vehicle. For the most part, we want to keep this but left to its defaults. We don't really need to mess with the drive factors at all. Likewise with the settings, unless you want to turn a thruster down, power scale doesn't do you a whole lot of good. Now this checkbox here is a little interesting. It smoothly scales thruster output up and down. So in the case of a jet engine, if I give it a signal to drive forward at 100%, say we just turned the AI on, and this flying vehicle is at 5 meters of altitude instead of the 100 it wants to maintain. Our upwards thrusters are going to immediately kick into full drive because we want the vehicle to rise rapidly. It really needs to get up there in the air. It has a long distance to go, so those are going to kick on at full power immediately. Now that's not always true because the thrusters have a slow ramp-up time, or a slight ramp-up time rather. They ramp up very quickly to their full thrust. But if you have this checkbox checked, that actually ramps up the throttle that we're attempting to apply along with the actual thruster. Our PIDs are effectively doing the same thing here, so with good PID control, you don't really need that checkbox. The summary down here is pretty much just a listing of what this thruster is going to do. It's telling you the same information as up here, but it's going to give that to you in kind of a summarized format. It's also going to tell you what the drive output is, so it's going to explain what's going on in the thruster at any given moment. If something changes about the vehicle, like the amount of thrust being put out changes, the vehicle is essentially going to, or rather the summary is it's going to tell you about that and let you know that, hey, things are changing, this thruster is trying to do something different than it was before. So that's useful, but Again, not terribly necessary beyond the initial configuration. So some other interesting things of note here. You'll note the pitcher, roller, and pusher preset for this thruster that I have selected up here on the back left down are green. These are all green. What does that mean? Well, if I start dragging this towards off, you'll note that the pusher preset got whiter. If I dragged it this way, it got greener. If I drag it this way, it starts getting red, all the way up to very red. Over here it's green. Well, what does that mean? Green is good, red is bad. If you've got it in red, that means the thruster is probably going to be trying to fight whatever the AI is doing in that direction. So if I had this pointing all the way up, this is a downwards facing thruster. If I try and have it translate the vehicle downwards, it's trying to push down as hard as it can on this back left corner. I have enough control authority elsewhere to counter this. In fact, if I unlock the vehicle here, I have enough control authority to counter what this is doing, but at the end of the day, it's still trying to fire downwards. That's not productive. That's not what I want, because it's trying to translate downwards while my input signal is to push upwards or lift upwards. So I don't want that in that direction. I want it in this direction. And that turns it off so that when I'm trying to gain lift, this isn't fighting me. Again, if I was to go down here and do the same thing, this is obviously green in the upwards direction, it's going to be red in the downwards direction, and right now I have basically turned this thruster off for all intents and purposes, because it's not doing what I want it to do, and in fact it's going to fight me if I ever try and go downwards rapidly with the vehicle. So green is good, red is bad. Get these things set to green and you're in good shape. Another trick here is that you don't always want these at 100%. If I look at this, say I'm getting an up signal and a roll right signal at the same time. Well, what am I going to do with that? I'm currently looking at this bottom left thruster facing upwards in the back. If I am trying to thrust upwards at 100% strength, say I'm at 5 altitude and I'm trying to reach 100, well, that's going to try and go upwards as rapidly as possible. And let's say I am also rolling to the left. So if I'm rolled to the left, I want to roll back to right to get perfectly upright. And if that's happening, then what I'm doing with this thruster is still going to be 100% on. It's still going to be 100% up thrust. So effectively, this thruster is not going to be able to roll me right anymore, because it's using 100% of its thrust for the upwards direction. If I was to set this to, say, 75%, that would allow me to always reserve some thrust for rolling right. And in fact, if I set these to all 75% in their respective directions, and if I was to mirror this across all other thrusters, effectively what I've done here is remove a little bit of control authority in each direction. I've removed a little bit of the maximum control authority I can exert in every direction in order to enhance the amount of control authority that I'm able to exert overall in several axes at once with this thruster. Another trick you can use with that very thing is to bring your thrusters out towards the center of mass, and if I had thrusters in the center of mass here, you know that these centered around the center of mass are going to be very ineffective for me in terms of pitching and rolling. So if I was to use any pitch or roll on these, I'd have it set to, say, 0.1 or 0.5, 0.05 rather. So if I was to try and use this for pitch, I'm not going to try and use it very much because it's so close to the center of mass it's not going to matter anyway. However, I want these very strong in the up direction because they're right near the center of mass, so they're going to be very effective at applying that translational movement axis, though not as effective in the rotational. So what I can do here is, now that I've got these thrusters upwards in the center, I can come out here and I don't need to exert nearly as much translational control authority out here because I've got that handled in the center. So I can bring these down because they're more valuable for controlling the pitch and roll. They're further away from the center of mass, so they have more pitch and roll control than the thrusters that are in the center. They're more valuable in those respects to me, so I want to make sure and use them to the best of their ability at what they're good at. Since these thrusters can't be used for it, then these thrusters out here don't need to be used for it. Alright, so we've taken a look at the 3 different translational axes, we've taken a look at the 3 different rotational axes, we've taken a look at control authority, and we know how to exert control authority by controlling our thrust around the center of mass and the center of mass itself. With drag, we can shift the center of drag around by shaping various sloped blocks. That primarily comes into play with fast-moving flying vehicles, but it can be useful to some degree for boats as well. For the most part, though, when we're constructing vehicles, center of drag is just going to exist. We're going to have enough control authority to overcome that in any given direction, so we don't really need to worry about it too much. And I think that's all that we are going to take a look at today, and later we will come back and take a look at how all of this plays into each type of vehicle movement. So looking forward to that, and hope to see you next time.